Welcome, everyone, to maybe our most minimalist episode of Table Talk we've done so far.
I would say an extra special Table Talk.
A very special episode of late afternoon gaming. Hello, Lee.
Yeah. Cutting that. Or maybe I'll bleep it. But, yeah, it's just me and Jack, Shepard and Jack. For all our new listeners out there, I checked our YouTube page, and we had been at 12 subscribers for a very long time, like for the past couple months. And then within the last week or so, we've gone up to 15.
Oh my.
And I have a theory as to who these people might be. It's tenuous, but I sent an email to the folks at Goodman Games, who are the creators of Dungeon Crawl Classics, among other things, because I want to run a DCC thing at some point for the podcast. So, despite the fact that nobody would ever come after our tiny operation here,
but we are no threat to anyone.
Right, but we play by the rules for everything, as far as I know. So, the music that we use is from Epidemic Sounds, and I've subscribed to it, and I'm I never use any copyrighted content kind of stuff like that, without having the license for it. And when we publish our Delta Green or D&D stuff, I always have the I don't own this thing that their sites say that you have to put on, podcasts or any other kind of content like that. So, I just want to make sure that we're covered with all that kind of stuff. So I was looking around on the Goodman Games DCC sites, and I didn't see a similar blurb about, hey, if you're making content, not producing a book, a module or something like that, but if you're just using our system for something like a podcast, what do you want us to say? I didn't see it anywhere, so I just sent an email to them and asked them, and it went something like this: hey, I'm Shepard, and I run a podcast no one listens to called Late Afternoon Gaming, and at some point we want to run DCC. I mean, let's be honest. And they got back to me at, within a couple days.
I was impressed by the
turnaround. Yeah, no, it was actually really quick. Given that I get the impression that Goodman Games is a relatively small operation, but they got back to me pretty fast. And I even told them hey, no rush, this isn't happening soon. But they hit me back with what they wanted us to do. Which the answer was basically, hey, just we don't have any specific thing you want us to say, just link to our site or our social media or whatever. Okay, easy enough.
Which, by the way, even if, as you said, this may be far in the future, but anybody who's interested in tabletop gaming and wants something a little more simpler and yet somehow way more intense, check out Dungeon Crawl Classics. It's super fun. We've discussed it on the podcast before, I think a couple of times, but yeah, it's a fantastic system. It's very lightweight, but it's the way the system is set up, it forces you to go into the first couple of scenarios with, instead of having a small group of highly qualified individuals, you have a bunch of bumpkins, and most of them will die. And it's just a very different dynamic, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and that funnel thing is optional. You don't have to do it. It is just one of the ways to start the game.
You should absolutely do the funnel.
The one that I'm planning on doing will start with a funnel. But anyway, so my theory is that someone over at Goodman Games was hey, I don't know how many DCC podcasts are out there, and I legitimately don't know. I've never looked.
Yeah, I suspect not many, but now
possibly,
there's one more.
I don't know. So, well, not yet, but maybe there will be one.
Yeah, eventually.
And so it's possible that they were hey, this random podcast, reach out to us, let's give it a listen and see if they're cool or whatever. Again, total theory, or speculation on my part. No idea if it's true, but that's my theory. If true, could someone from Goodman Games comment on our YouTube or something and let me know? But anyway, so. I don't remember where I was going with that, but I was just saying
you just mentioned that we had a couple of subscribers. A 25% increase. That's a more fun way to say it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's like, but it's like the sensationalist news of like shark attacks up 100% this year because it went from like 2 to 4
Yeah.
across the nation. Yeah. So, but yeah, we're still like on podcast downloads. We're still averaging somewhere in the ballpark of about 20 downloads per episode, which has been pretty stable for basically the entire time we've been doing this. So, but I will say, given that we are now putting it out on more platforms and that has stayed steady, because now we use YouTube as well. And my suspicion is that most people, me being probably the one exception, choose one or the other generally. Like if they start listening to a 1-hour podcast, they're probably not going to pick up partway through on the YouTube video. They're just going to continue on, if they're listening to the whole thing, on whichever one they started for that particular episode.
Yeah, I'm not aware if there's any, it would have to be a third party thing that allows you to jump seamlessly between them. Something that can, like, if you feed it a YouTube link, it'll say, oh yeah, that means I'll put your Spotify thing here. I don't think that exists.
No, right, like a bookmark that can travel between apps, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I've not seen such a thing.
AI will fix it.
You could totally do that with ours, because I think this is probably pretty common. The podcasts and the YouTube videos are the exact same length, and there's no difference audio-wise between the two. The podcast I think is higher quality audio than the YouTube video, but in terms of like the speed or pauses or anything, they're all exactly the same.
Yeah, I don't know for other podcasts because I'm not much of a podcast guy, and if I am, it's going to be on Pocket Casts. I don't use multiple things, but I don't know to what extent larger podcasts have like different front matter if it's going to be on different platforms. I can't imagine that's that common, because I don't see why you would do it.
So I'm not like an expert podcaster. We make this podcast and I only use Simplecast. My understanding, based on looking into different platforms and like the little amount of research I did before I landed on Simplecast, most of them, they provide the same service. They host it and then produce the RSS feed that then feeds into all of the other podcasting platforms. That platform will also usually handle however the advertising thing works. So, for some of the advertising ones, some of it is user generated, or like, whoever the content producer is makes their own ads, because, Raid Shadow Legends or whoever, paid them to, do a bespoke ad on their own, podcast or whatever. But then other podcasts will have like straight up ads, which I've seen more and more of, where it's some other, party making some audio thing that they throw into yours, almost the same as like a YouTube one. And so the RSS feed will like periodically update your podcast with different ads of the same length that go into that podcast. Because you can edit or change ones that you've made in the past, and then it'll just resend that out on the feed. I've had to do that a couple times when like I wanted to edit something out post facto, or whatever. So that's how some of the ads work, but it's all done from the like the hosting place, not through the app that you use to actually listen to the podcast.
I would love to see the balance sheet for whatever company owns Raid Shadow Legends, because I've never heard anyone actually talk about it. I'm not aware of anybody who plays it, but they have dropped what appears to be a significant amount of money on advertising. So
yes, I would say
a lot
probably
of people
yes.
are playing it and not talking about it, or the people who are playing it are spending a lot of money, or advertising is a lot cheaper than I think it is.
I think they also do a little more targeting with their ads, where I think they probably do have TV spots that they do, which are going to be more expensive typically, and like less. It's harder to tell whether they're being effective. Whereas if you do an ad contract with, like, let's say someone did an ad contract with us for our YouTube channel or something like that. Right, yeah, or Internet Historian or whatever. So, usually those will be associated with a certain code. Like, hey, if you go to Raid Shadow Legends and then input code, lag 420 or, whatever, like, that code is associated with us, so they can directly track, like, which content creators that they're paying for their ads are producing the most for them, and that's part of the deal a lot of times, especially for like the smaller content creators, right, where it's like a per click payment, and you probably after some certain period of time it'll pay out. Not that I know everything about this, but that's how I suspect that would work, and that's probably going to end up being cheaper and more. You can do better analytics on how well it's actually working per creator if you're doing something like that than doing a traditional TV spot. So that's how I imagine that math works out. Now, when it comes to those kinds of games, my understanding is a lot of them, those free-to-play models where anybody can play, but then, the people who like it the most are going to do those microtransactions to get better characters or gear or play it faster or, grind less, whatever the case may be. A lot of those systems rely on whales, the people who are willing to spend lots of money on it. Right. And then that's where they make all their money. And obviously they're just losing money on people who are playing the free-to-play version and not getting into any of the payment stuff.
I understand kind of the psychology behind it, but I can't personally get the, if it's an anti-grind thing, like you're saying, oh, I can get this equipment by playing the game for a while, or I can just pay this much money. You're paying money to not play the game.
Yeah, well, sort of, but you're really paying money to skip the parts of the game that are less fun. So there's a YouTube channel that featured a game called it was called Microtransactions the Game or something like that. It was on a channel I believe called Mitch Mannix. It was very specifically trying to call out he's playing the game, and the developer of the game was trying to highlight the techniques that free-to-play game makers use in order to try to...
I think I found someone made Pay to Win the Game, and it's hilarious.
Is it? Yeah, it's by Mitch Mannix.
Mitch Mannix, you used the wrong its. So if you see this video, change that.
Okay, so yeah, go ahead and link that. But, it's a pretty funny video, and it goes into... it describes what the game is describing of, for example, you start out giving the player... let's say there's some sort of speed token that you can use to get through some grinding thing faster, or to get experience faster, so you don't have to grind as much.
You give them some up front so they get used to it, then they taper off, and they go, oh, well, this was easier when I had the token. Yeah, I understand the psychology. I just can't understand the kind of person who goes through with it.
I can, especially if those individual transactions seem relatively minor. And especially a lot of people, I think, go in with the psychology of, well, I didn't have to pay for this game in the first place. So if I spend no more than $30 on any microtransactions, then, if that made the game more fun, then that's what I would be paying for a paid game or something like that. Or I might still come out ahead if I'm only spending 30 and it's a big game. And so I think that, you can get into a bit of a habit doing that at first, and then say, once you get to that $30 or $50 or $60 mark or whatever, be like, well, but I'm having fun. I think this is fun, and I'm willing to spend a little more. And I think that people can get into a cycle then where they lose track of what they're doing. Or they would legitimately tell you, no, I think this is fun enough and I care enough about it that I'm okay with doing that. I'm okay with giving these guys more money because I think that, it's worth it to me. I mean, you could also consider it to be not dissimilar from a game that has a subscription model, like a lot of MMORPGs did, like World of Warcraft for a long time. I think they're one of the few that still does this, actually, is they actually have the monthly subscription as opposed to going to a free-to-play model. So if you're spending no more than $10 a month on these microtransactions, what's the difference between that and doing a flat subscription rate?
Now, I guess I'm also not too sold on subscription games, but that's just me, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think the idea with a subscription game, again, let's use World of Warcraft as an example. I think that the idea is that they're constantly updating it, and so it's a transforming game. And I mean, games like that do cost a lot of money to maintain, especially, with lots of players. So if the quality of game is good enough, if, again, let's just do the math. If you buy 3 video games a year, instead spend that money on a World of Warcraft subscription that year. It's the same amount of money, but it's a game that you get to continue experiencing like with your guild and friends and whatever. And I think that value proposition can actually be quite good. And you can build a deeper connection to that game and the people in it. So I can totally see. I'm not an MMO player. I played RuneScape a little as a kid. That's as far as I got into MMOs, but I can totally see where like that is a totally fair trade-off for value. It's just I think it also can become easy to exploit, and that's one of the biggest criticism of the free-to-play model, as opposed to the pay-to-play or the subscription model. Or sorry, buy-to-play, pay-to-play, and free-to-play, also known as pay-to-win.
Freemium.
Yeah. So I think the like sort of the economics and how game developers and publishers come to the decisions about what kind of model they use and when they change from one to another. The Old Republic
Yeah.
did that, where it was a paid subscription model for a very long time, and then it went free to play. That's a very common transition, and usually game developers find that, or game publishers find that they start making more money when they switch to free to play, which seems counterintuitive, but free to play comes along with usually microtransactions of some kind, whether it's just cosmetics or some sort of development of a pay to win system. So I know like Psyonix did that when Unreal or Epic Games bought Rocket League. They switched to a free-to-play model, and then it's all just new cars, cosmetics, stuff like that don't necessarily give you any advantage at all. It's all purely cosmetic changes, but they found they were making more money. So
don't different cars have different hitboxes?
They do, but in Rocket League, there's like 6 or so, I think, hit boxes, and then all cars fit within those 6. And so even if they look a little different, their hit boxes will be the same.
Huh.
So which like people will get mad about in Rocket League, where like it looks like their car hit a ball and it didn't, and so they got scored on when they feel like they shouldn't have, and then they send a tweet about it.
What a save! What a save!
Right, what a save, what a save, what a save. I actually tried to download Rocket League the other day and play it, and I was downloading it on Steam, which I think it's no longer...
launch it through Epic, though.
Well, something like that. So I had played it on Steam a long, long time ago, and like I don't know where all the accounts live these days, but I was just like, I just want to play it again. I downloaded it off Steam and I tried to log in. It wouldn't let me log in through it. I had to log in through Epic Games, through whichever account had been associated with my Steam account. And I could not for the life of me figure out what account that was. And like I tried it for like 30 minutes. I just gave up. I was like, I'm not playing this game. It's just not worth my time. But this goes into, or sort of this relates into one of the topics I wanted to bring up during this table talk, which is the second one I have bulleted here, which is how stories develop in multiplayer games. So we were talking about MMOs. I'm not an MMO player, like I said earlier, but I find MMOs fascinating in a lot of ways. And Frederick Knudsen, or Knudsen, I don't know how you pronounce it, released a video this week. It's like a 6-hour-long video about the history of EVE Online. And it's like an incredible video. I don't know how long it took this guy to make it, but it's really, really interesting, and it chronicles the history of, basically from when the game started to sometime relatively recently. And I thought it was really neat because I've never played EVE Online, but it's like a sandbox type game where there are like quests or something that you can get from NPCs, I think, but by and large, it's, the sort of the goals that people generate are self-made.
It's extremely player-driven. And people like, there are people who log in to EVE Online and basically mess around with spreadsheets for hours, and that's them playing the game. Because they're
right.
Like, that's what they do, is they're part of a bank.
Right, they're part of a bank or a casino, or they're like in charge of, like, the guilds in that game are called corporations. And it was really, really interesting to see like a broad overview of the history of like the conflicts in the game, because it's a lot about like space warfare and all these corporations like aligning against each other and these like epic battles they fight, which of course these big moments only characterize, you know, sort of a small portion of the entire history of the game. And most any individual user that you find, their history would be, you know, probably relatively boring, or only have, you know, a very small percentage of their time would be interesting to any outsiders. But to me, that's pretty reflective of real life. I mean, how many days do most people have that would be interesting to anyone else? And so, like, I think that the histories of those kinds of exchanges are no less interesting in that kind of space, in like an MMO, than anything in real life. I'm really interested in that kind of stuff because you can have like, you know, people in real life who are doing whatever, you know, let's say that you just have some regular office job, you're some pencil pusher somewhere, and, you know, you don't do anything remarkable, but then you have like this other life essentially where, or like you play a bigger role somewhere else. You're a pencil pusher by day, and then you run the biggest EVE Online casino by night, and, you know, your decisions on how you do things or where you allocate those funds or whatever have like emotional impacts on, well, like a lot of people throughout the world. And so like it's really interesting, I think, to see stories of those people, and I can totally understand why people would get sucked into something like that and, you know, really care about it. And I don't see that as silly or illegitimate. I think it's utterly fascinating, and I think a really cool thing to come out of it. But what really interested me was the way Frederick was telling the story, you know, of like a certain battle or something like that. And I thought it was a really neat sort of case study in looking at how stories develop between people in like a virtual or imaginary space, you know, when someone else isn't telling them how they should be having fun or how to, you know, explore this space.
Yeah, EVE Online is a more direct example because you actually have people actively playing, you know, at the same time for or against each other and forming alliances. There was, I don't know if you ever got into Dwarf Fortress at all.
No, so I've heard that it's like this crazy complex game.
It is incredibly complicated.
I've never checked it out.
I have really failed to get into it mechanically, although it did have a release on Steam in the last couple of years that I heard makes it a lot more accessible while still maintaining the complexity. But
right, because I think it started as like a DOS game or something, right?
It at least has the aesthetic, and I believe you are correct that that is its true origin. But there was a thing that they did. They being people who played the game. I don't think the actual developers were involved. This was just a group of people on like old forums where they would, you know, somebody would start a world and they would play the game a bit and sort of write out a chronicle of what happened during their playthrough, save the file, pass it to somebody else, and then that person would pick it up, play the game a bit. I don't know how they tracked it. It may have been like, you know, so many days that they have the file, write down a history of what happened when they did it, and at the end, you know, when inevitably the fortress falls apart because it got flooded with lava or whatever, that's how a lot of these things end, you would have this several player long history, and it's a lot of, you know, the first player gets it, has to deal with some crazy terrain or some, you know, there's some hostile activity that's nearby, and ends up with the best solution they can come up with, passes it to the next guy, who immediately freaks out and goes, "What the hell were you thinking?" And isn't able to really just adds to the problem, because they half fix those problems while creating 20 more of their own, pass it to a third guy who goes, "Oh no," and the cycle just repeats over and over again. And there was one called, I think the name of the story, I'll have to find it, but I believe it was called Boat Murdered. was the name of the chronicle. That's evocative. Came out. And it's I read it years ago, and it was hilarious. I gotta try to get into Dwarf Fortress again.
Yeah, that sounds super neat. I'd love to read it.
I will find it, and I'll put the link in.
Okay, yeah, I'll. It sounds incredible. I never heard of that in particular with Dwarf Fortress. But yeah, I know that that's supposed to be like just one of those like dastardly games that like like nobody fully understands what's going on with it behind the scenes, which I thought was really interesting, especially given its age. But I'm really interested in how those stories develop when people are interacting, which that sounds like a really interesting version of like a passed on story that is driven by, basically die rolls. Like you just have to deal with some randomness in there, and then the consequences of what came before you, which I think is really funny. But I think whenever you've got people together in a space where you define some rule set and then just say like go, like stories naturally develop, and I think your personal interaction with that makes them seem really significant, and you see it in any sort of environment like that. Sports is a great example. If you just get some people together and tell them the rules of football or whatever, and then they get together and start playing it, like there's no way that the day ends without like an incredible story emerging from it that all those people will feel very strongly about one way or another. And I think that giving players control over that kind of stuff, or letting them determine what a win condition is, or what a goal should be, or what principles people should adhere to while playing these games, I think is, it's fascinating to see those develop, and it's really interesting to hear people tell that story as someone who is on the inside of it to someone who's on the outside. One example that I love to give for that is you and Duncan had been playing Dark Souls, or those Souls games, for a very long time. And
getting you inducted into that society was a blast.
Yeah. Oh, I love those games now. But I didn't start playing. I finally like sunk my teeth into Dark Souls 3 in like I think 2020 or no 2021. Anyway, it's relatively recently, and I was kind of 10 years or so behind the curve with this when it came to like the strange multiplayer etiquette of the Dark Souls games. Not that everyone follows it, but like the rules of like a lawful duel, essentially, that a lot of people have kind of come up with over time. Not that two people are necessarily going to agree on it, but like the first time someone invaded me, when one of you was helping me out, I was like, oh great, we're just gonna gank him, right? And I think it was Duncan. He was like, no, you're gonna fight this guy yourself. I was like, why? I need to get to the bonfire. So, of course, this guy starts beating me up really bad, and so I start drinking Estus, and Duncan is just, like, clucking his tongue at me. like, you sicko, I can't believe you would do this.
Now you know what would happen if you'd been playing with me.
Yeah, true. An entirely different game would have developed.
Yeah.
But, the existence of those rules and my eventual, adherence to them, made it more interesting to me. To play these games. And then when someone else would come in and violate them in some way, it creates like this weird, a weird situation that couldn't possibly develop any other way. And so, when I think back to my multiplayer experiences in Dark Souls 3, for example, I'd be coming out of Pontiff Sulivan, heading up to, what's his name? Aldrich. And that pathway is usually blocked if you're embered with a bunch of unfriendly players. So I started loving that part of the game, though, because I'd run in and I'd have to like duel one to the death, and then one would just stand off to the side, like, watching, waiting until I won or something, and then step in and then duel me at the same time. And it was just this weird like dueling etiquette that like created a new, different story every time, and it was super fascinating.
Speaking of embering,
inscrutable possibly to people who are unfamiliar with it, unless someone talks them through it, and then it becomes interesting.
Speaking of embering, this is something that made me laugh when I sort of realized it a couple of years ago. For people who haven't played Dark Souls 3, you have your normal health bar, and like if you just progressing through the level, that's how much health you'll have, and it's exactly the way you would expect a health bar to work. However, there is a consumable item. It's limited use. You only have so many of them. You can find them out in the world, but there's a finite number of these things that you can consume. It's called an
I think
ember.
you can farm them off rats.
Can you? I know you can get them using online play, but either way, it's not something you can just use willy-nilly. You will eventually run out, and it's a hassle to get more of them. But if you use it, you will get extra health. You'll have bonus health. It just makes your health bar bigger until you die. Once you die, the effects of the ember go away. If you want it back, you have to use another one. Demon Souls had
Hard mode.
No, Demon Souls had the exact same mechanic. You had a normal health bar, and if you used a consumable item, you got a bigger health bar. But it was branded differently. In Dark Souls, if you died, you were at your normal, and then the ember gave you bonus health. In Demon Souls, normal was the longer health bar, and then if you died, you had, penalized health. But mechanically speaking, if you had just died, you had a health bar, and then you used a consumable item, and you got a bigger health bar that lasted until you died. It is the same mechanic, it's just different PR. You would not believe how different the responses were from people to these two identical mechanics. Just because one of them was branded as a bonus, and one of them was branded as a penalty. But functionally, they're exactly the same.
I would say there are some differences worth noting. So in Demon Souls, that penalty is 50% of your HP, not including character tendency or the cling ring. So that's a much bigger difference than when you use an ember, you get like a 20% bonus, if that. The difference between those two states is the magnitude is much greater in Demon Souls. So I think that is worth noting.
But I suspect that if you equalized those differences, people would still be mad at the Demon Souls system in a way that they wouldn't be mad at the Dark Souls system.
Yeah, I think that may be true.
Just because one of them feels like a penalty, and then one of them feels like, you're taking control.
Yeah. No, I get that. Well, I think Dark Souls 2 is actually a pretty good compromise on that.
Yeah, Dark Souls 2 had a lot of good ideas that were not carried forward just because a lot of people didn't like Dark Souls 2.
I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, I can understand why a lot of people didn't like it, but personally, I think it had more hits than misses.
Yeah, I agree.
The biggest issue I had with Dark Souls 2 was it felt like, and I never actually sat down with a stopwatch to verify this, but the window of time after you took an action that consumed stamina, and then you eventually start recovering it, that window of nothing happening was just a little bit too long. So if you took a swing with your sword and you'd lose a bit of stamina, it would take slightly too long for your stamina to start recovering again. I found myself running out of stamina way more often in Dark Souls 2, and I never knew if that was just me.
No, I agree. When I was playing Dark Souls 2, I felt like it was absolutely necessary to have the Chloranthy ring, which is the one that increases stamina regen speed.
Yep.
I was like, you have to play with this thing on. At least for me, because I wasn't some expert at it. But I want to say that either adaptability or dexterity reduces that time in Dark Souls 2.
Yeah, but that just means you gotta keep splitting your stats out. That was the thing that bothered me the most about that game, really, was adaptability. I felt like subsequent games did the right call getting rid of that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a little different in every game. The thing that went back and forth a couple times was whether endurance or whatever the stamina trait was going to apply to your armor or not. So in Dark Souls 3, it didn't, and so you had to there was another stat that was your
vitality versus vigor.
Yeah, right. Because I think vigor was your health and vitality was your armor, or maybe the other way around.
Armor and resistances as well.
Yeah, but great games. They'll figure it out one day. Well, I mean, I think by and large they figured it out with Dark Souls 3. I think it's good. Although I wish they had power stancing. But yeah, whatever.
If Elden Ring had seamless co-op, it would be the end game.
That's not in some ways.
Yeah. As I said that I disagreed with it, but that would definitely help. That is one thing that I wish From Software would figure out is, people want to be able to just play these games together.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting to kind of have the drop in, drop out random stranger help you with a boss fight kind of thing.
I think it's interesting too, but I think there should be an option to do more of a seamless co-op thing that progresses both of your files.
Yeah, like Ashen. I think Ashen does it perfectly,
Like Ashen.
or pretty close to it. But
I can see one reason why they might not want to do that, because there's so many diverging NPC quest lines that if two people tried to join a game and had two different branches going on, it would be very hard to mesh those. But if you had an option at the beginning of the game to say, these two files are going to be linked and we're going to play together, and once we split off, then we can never rejoin, but as long as we're proceeding together, just let us keep doing that.
right. So like for example, in Elden Ring, if you kill Ronnie, then you can never get, up to that top part in Liurnia. Right? Whereas if I go with Ronnie's quest line, then I can get up there, right?
Yeah.
And that would be something where it's not just like you can't talk to that person anymore. It's like a whole area that you can't access anymore.
Yep. But I think I think they could build in a system that says, yes, we understand that's an issue. We're going to solve that by linking the worlds. Just let us play the game.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, those games are awesome. But again, I think that the thing that makes those games so great for me, I mean, the gameplay is great and the stories are cool and all that, but being able to play them together and then having, bringing it back to what I was saying, like, it's the story that comes out of it. And like the unique experience that we have playing it that no other people are going to have. They'll have their own unique experiences. I think that those are the things that make it the most interesting to me. And so I'm really, again, just really interested in like the telling of those kinds of stories and how they can develop. And the more options you have in a game and the more sandboxy it is. And again, that's true for video games or for, a tabletop role-playing game or whatever. The more those stories can develop in weird and unique directions that other people, will never be able to personally experience, but they'll get to have their own equally interesting, experience with it. And I think that's really cool.
I think people should enjoy games the same way I do.
Oh, yeah, there's one correct perspective, and it's mine.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I wanted to talk about, talking stories and games as well, is this is point 1 on my potential topics list. Golden River Underground Session 9, which was the dinner party one. We had some folks on the Discord server who expressed some confusion over what are you guys going for with this?
Yeah.
And I think that is entirely warranted. I think to you, me, and Duncan, it's like pretty obvious what we're doing. But I think we kind of went in with an idea that is maybe a little different than what a lot of people are used to when they play or listen to something like this. But I'd like to hear your perspective first, Jack, before I launch into mine. Like, what do you think we're going for? Why did that session end up the way it did? Like, what are we doing?
I think it ended up the way it did because we were having an extremely low stakes social event.
That's true.
I mean, you've played enough games with both of us, and we both played enough games with you to know that when the stakes are low, dumb things are going to happen. And personally, I have no problem with that. I think it's funny, and I think it was a good way to. It had been a while since we did a session. This is a way for us to get back with the characters in a way that wasn't going to cause any lasting damage. Instead of, making decisions that maybe don't make a lot of sense because we're kind of getting back into it and then later going, ooh, I wish I hadn't done that. Nothing we did in that session mattered at all. And maybe this is just me. I don't mind having that every once in a while. Like, obviously, Delta Green is going to be a more serious type of scenario, a more serious type of campaign. But having little breather episodes like that where you're just fucking around and having a good time is fine. And I almost think it's the kind of thing that you would expect to happen in a scenario like that, is people saying, oh, here is finally a situation where I can just do goofy stuff without getting hurt.
Okay, yeah, I think those are all good points. Here's a question. Why would we apart from, why from a story perspective would we want to do like a low stakes encounter with some NPCs?
From a story perspective, it would be a maintaining your sanity thing. Are you talking about within character, or are you talking about from a meta perspective?
From a meta perspective.
Oh, I don't know, because it's funny.
Okay, so that's one. So what Duncan was talking about the other night is, I think, a really interesting point that I think is really it's something that I think is sort of important if you're doing a long form Delta Green campaign, at least the way we're doing it, which is one of the reasons why you want to have interactions like that with NPCs in the game world is that it actually puts, a face to a name in some way. Like, it humanizes the world and the people in it, so that when it inevitably all goes wrong, as things tend to do in Delta Green in one form or another, let's say to Kings of Kings Vineyard Church, like something happens to it, it burns down for some reason, those other agents burn it down for some reason, and Anita is in it. Like, if that's just a name that got brought up at some point during session 0 where I mentioned that that's one of my bonds, then it's like, yeah, that's like, okay, I guess that's bad. But if you've
now
actually
the audience
met
is actively rooting for the fire.
or now that, like, we as players in the game, and then the audience as well, now that they actually have met these characters, having something happen to them means something a little more. It might not be earth-shattering, but it doesn't mean, it's not just like Data, where it otherwise might be, where, his sister-in-law died in a fire. It's like, I guess he probably feels bad about that. And not that we've done all the work of making her a fully fleshed out character or whatever, but there's something there. We're building the world and making it seem like our characters are like citizens of that world, and they care about it, and there are things to care about in it. And so when bad things happen, it matters. And, so even if we have like a very comical dinner scene with them and there's no obvious immediate story value to it, that's sort of the story and world building things that you can do with such an event when you're running a game, that I think is really interesting. And not that was the entire intent, but it is one of the biggest and most impactful results, and one of the reasons why Duncan wanted to kind of lean into doing that kind of interaction.
Yeah, I would be lying if I said I was thinking that deeply about it. I just thought it was entertaining, so I kept doing it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that was the reason why I had my character invite you, right? Because it would have been kind of weird to do like an hour-long role play of just me and Duncan, and you're just like sitting off to the side in the peanut gallery. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, why don't we bring Tim along? Because Tim is like a crazy guy right now, and
or is he the only sane guy?
Yeah, that could be. You know what I mean? Like, that was naturally going to be, funny, obviously, and include you in, what could have been a very long scene, as well as, generate some more comedy. But, that was something we've talked about. And so the reason I wanted to bring that up is because if people on the server had some questions about, what the point of such an exercise was, it's entirely possible that there are other listeners out there who were wondering something along the same lines of like, aren't they supposed to be investigating stuff? Like, what's going on? This doesn't feel like Delta Green. And the point of me bringing this up is that I think that kind of storytelling has a lot of merit, and can make the horribleness to come that much more impactful and interesting when we have those kinds of interactions. Not that it's necessarily going to happen, but the more NPCs we interact with, the more the world gets fleshed out, and the more listeners and players might end up caring about that world, and really flesh out the story and characters.
Which is why we're going to be doing dinner scenes every other session.
Yeah, I don't know. That might be a bit much, but and I think there's degrees of that. That one was entirely separate from the investigation, but you can have a good interaction between Simon and the chief, or your character and Maggie, or with the coroner, or whatever, that continues to make these characters unique and interesting. And you can have relationships become more or less tense. Like, your character's relationship with Maggie is like not great right now, right? But Maggie is like, she's a character here, and so if something went wrong with her, okay, that actually matters. Like, I would care. I don't know if you or Tim would, but I would. So it's
No
I think
comment.
it's an interesting way to build out the world and tell a more like complete story together. Given that we improvise most of what's going on within the framework of the adventure that Duncan is trying to sort of lay out for us in a sense. I think it's a good way to have a real story be told as opposed to it just being a lot of admin. Like for example, Bustin'. the D&D session we just had. A lot of admin, right? Like not really a lot of story going on there. There is some story. But the way I'm running most of those downtimes, it's very on rails, and it's because each one is supposed to be mostly self-contained, and so I don't want to give people too much freedom to just run off and do something totally unrelated. So I give you like a very, kind of clear goal, and then sort of shepherd you towards different set pieces. Right, but the end result is that there's not a lot of room for creativity a lot of times. You guys do your best, but it ends up being a lot of more admin than anything else. Which I call anything that involves die rolling admin, for anyone who's confused. But I mean, you listen to, especially like It's Where My Demons Hide. It's nothing but die rolls the whole time, and the players make very few decisions of any like story significance. So it's a very different way to run those kinds of things, and I really like where Gru is going, and so that's why I kind of wanted to bring it up and talk about sort of the reasons why something like that is actually valuable in addition to being entertaining and funny. There's actually a story, or like there's a reason why it actually impacts the story in a way that I find really interesting and not unique, but maybe somewhat uncommon in these kinds of games. But speaking of Delta Green, I brought it up before we started recording. Recently, the game Alan Wake 2 came out.
Yes.
So we often have discussions on this server about Delta Green adjacent media. So Delta Green and sort of Call of Cthulhu and those kinds of things have like sort of an interesting air to them, like some themes of sort of eldritch horror and growing insanity or paranoia, and so often we'll have discussions on the server about like, hey, what are some good Delta Green type movies, or games or books or whatever, in addition to like, hey, are there any good Delta Green actual play podcasts out there or whatever. And my personal opinion is that Alan Wake and Control are both really good like genre type games for that same kind of atmosphere and feeling.
I'd say it's some of the best there is.
Yeah. I think Control in particular, I think is really good for that. Alan Wake is it's a great game in general, and I think it is very good for that. I think that Control is a little more directly similar to the Delta Green vibe. But I just started playing Alan Wake 2, and it is very, very much in that vein. And they're cool games and like really interesting, I think, but they also have a really good link to Delta Green, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you and I really got in on the ground floor on Alan Wake. It seems like a lot of people went back to play Alan Wake when the DLC for Control came out that was related to Alan Wake.
Yeah, like, who is this guy? What is this writer? I don't understand.
Yeah, because while the game, I think, received pretty favorable reviews, I don't think it wasn't like a big blockbuster hit. A lot of people had never heard of Alan Wake. But man, like, what a great game. And it holds up, too. About a couple of weeks ago, leading up to Halloween, I was playing the original Alan Wake. Well, I guess it was the remastered version on PC, but it's the same game. It's just upscaled a bit, and, it controls a bit better because you can use a mouse. But great writing, great acting, great story. And it plays well for a game that came out in like 2009 or something.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that made it weird at the time, or maybe like didn't capture people as much, was I think that time period was around the time when video games started like becoming an acceptable medium for telling a story as opposed to just being a gameplay experience.
Mm-hmm.
I remember there was I don't remember if it was a special feature or an interview or something on the first Uncharted game where they were talking about a moment in the game where they were like really thinking like, hey, the things that we're doing here could be really cinematic in addition to being, a fun gameplay experience. And it was this moment early on in the game where you can shoot a barrel and it causes a truck to explode and flip off a cliff, taking some enemies with it or something. And it was like a cinematic thing that you can miss if you don't hit that prompt or something. But that came out around the same time. So, not that games didn't have stories leading up to that point, but usually the story was something that, was happening sort of as the gameplay continues to be the focus. Whereas if you're playing Alan Wake, the gameplay's there, but it's nothing groundbreaking. And in fact, I remember one of the things people complaining about at the time was that Alan Wake could only run 10 steps before huffing and wheezing.
That is one of the biggest. So I'm playing it on PC, and I have a mod that gives me unlimited sprinting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh my, what an improvement!
Yeah, right. And so again, there's not. It's not that there's nothing innovative about the gameplay, but most of the gameplay is pretty standard stuff, especially for the time. Third person, over the shoulder shooter kind of thing. When you're not doing that, you're literally just walking around, talking to people, pressing A on some prompt or whatever. So I think as people were sort of adjusting to that, that use of gameplays as a video games as a storytelling medium, I think that it just didn't resonate as much with people then as those kinds of games do now, where that kind of thing is way more common. So I think that probably has something to do with the original Alan Wake's, not tepid reaction, but not being as successful and resonating with as many people as maybe, the same kind of thing releasing now does.
Yeah. I do think that people, because I do also recall people saying, oh, the gameplay is kind of unoriginal. I really liked the light mechanic. For anybody who hasn't played the game, You're walking around. Pretty much all the enemies in the game are sort of possessed by this shadow being, and the only way you can hurt, you have a gun, and you can shoot people with it, but it's not going to hurt them at all. The gun will do nothing except maybe knock them back, unless you can burn the shadows off of them, and you do that by pointing your flashlight at them. And the flashlight basically serves as your reticle, so as you move it around, wherever you're pointing, the flashlight's pointing at it. But if you have two people coming at you from different directions, you have to sort of balance how much you're looking at one or the other, and they'll try to circle around you. They'll try to get out of your field of view. And if you're not looking at one for long enough, you're not going to be able to hurt him by the time he gets to you. So there's this interesting thing where you're not just balancing how often you're shooting at somebody, you have to balance how often you're even looking at them, otherwise you're not going to be able to hurt them. And in a situation where you are surrounded and have to be looking every which way just to balance and make sure you know where everybody is and try to burn all those shadows off so you can actually get to killing, it creates some surprisingly tense situations, and I think it's a really cool mechanic. I never really heard anybody bring that up as an innovative thing, but it absolutely is.
Yeah, no, I'll agree with that. I think especially if you're not playing on the hardest difficulty, then which I think is called Nightmare. I think that those situations don't really come up that often unless you're consciously trying to make them happen. I think so. Maybe that could be part of it. Or I think probably a lot of people who played the game probably didn't finish it because they didn't find the gameplay loop itself to be particularly motivating. And so probably opportunities to experience some tension like that might have been missed by a lot of people just by virtue of not playing it that long.
Yeah, totally possible. But I find it very compelling.
Yeah. Well, and the story itself is super duper interesting, I think.
Yeah.
But
got so many twists and turns. And especially how it ties into their later games. I never played Quantum Break, so I don't know if it has anything to do with that. To my knowledge, it's not heavily tied in, if it is at all. But, it's been long enough that I think we can probably... spoilers for Control. Control is... You find out during the DLC, or one of the DLCs, is a sequel to Alan Wake. And story relationship between Control and Alan Wake is there's like multiple different ways of interpreting it. It's possible it gets resolved in Alan Wake 2, but there's still a lot of like questions of what's actually real, what's actually like, was Alan Wake an actual person who wrote the world of Control into existence? Was Thomas Zane a real person from Alan Wake, or is that someone that Alan came up with, or did Thomas Zane come up with Alan Wake? Like, you don't know any of this stuff. There's just a lot of dangling threads, and it makes me really want, like, gameplay aside, because I know it's going to be fantastic from the fact that Remedy Entertainment is making it, and also from what little I've seen online. Like, I know it's going to be a fun game. I want to play just to find out what's going on. Go play Alan Wake. Go play Control. Play the DLC.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think. Comment on our YouTube videos.
Yeah, like, subscribe, leave a review.
This is my call to action.
Yeah. I have been thinking about that a little bit. I watch a good amount of YouTube stuff, and we've talked about it before. You're supposed to have like a call to action in order to get more like participation, liking, subscribing, leaving a comment. A lot of times when you're watching a video and someone says like, hey, what did you think of that? Hey, did you like Alan Wake 2? Let us know in the comments, right? They're not just saying that just out of hand. Like, that's a deliberate technique that people use in order to increase engagement.
Yeah, they're checking their box. You either do that or you say something wrong.
Right, yeah, or something that needs to be corrected. Well, actually, and then... well, I don't want to cast aspersions on people who, want to correct information, but I actually hadn't heard of that one, but it makes perfect sense of deliberately doing something incorrect to generate commentary from the crowd about something. That's interesting. I don't think I want to do that. We get enough stuff wrong on accident that I don't think it's necessary.
No, we can, but are we being maximally inflammatory about it?
Oh, should we? Yeah, we should assign some like moral stance towards whatever we're deliberately wrong about.
Next week, Tim flies to Israel.
Well, it's 1995, so.
Well, and goes into a coma for 30 years.
yeah. But yeah, interesting stuff. Alan Wake is cool. Frederick Knudsen is cool. MMOs are cool. What else is cool?
Boat Murdered and play Dwarf
Boat
Fortress.
Murdered, yeah, Dwarf Fortress is cool. I can't wait to check that out. That sounds super interesting.
I have to go I'm curious to hear to see if I find it as funny now as I did like 15 years ago when I read it.
Maybe we should do a dramatic reading of it as a special bonus episode.
I don't think that it's not our content.
Well, if we do something creative enough with it.
If we just say fair use a lot at the beginning.
Fair use. That makes it ours or something.
Yeah, that's how that works. It might be terrible. I remember it being funny.
Yeah, well, and that happens a lot, but it also, again, I think it sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like, your connection to those kinds of stories has a lot to do with its value.
Remember, audience, if you don't like it, I was saying this ironically.
Right. No, but like, especially if you are a Dwarf Fortress player, and like the things that people are saying are events that, seem conceivable to you, then I think that story carries a lot more value than, if someone just reads the story, not even understanding what the context is or how the story came to be. They're like, this is like horrible from a narrative standpoint. Like, what's going on? So being on the inside, matters. In some way, or having a connection to it. And that's why I think that Frederick Knudsen video of EVE Online does such a good job of explaining things just enough so that people on the outside of EVE can appreciate the story that he's weaving about, this decades almost long, series of conflicts in the game and how they came to be and why they matter. Interesting stuff.
One final note, Dwarf Fortress is in the Museum of Modern Arts in New York City.
Really?
Yeah.
The MoMA?
The MoMA.
That's interesting. I think it's an interesting debate. Who was it? Was it some famous film critic, Siskel or Ebert? I can't remember which one. The one that's still alive. Yeah. Roger Ebert was saying that like video games will never be art or something like that. And that was
I think
a somewhat
he turned around on
inflammatory
that
comment.
at some point.
He may have. It's just
Doesn't
the
matter
initial
if he
comment.
did, he's wrong. You heard it here first, folks.
Whichever side he's on is the incorrect one. But I think it's an interesting question of, where do you draw the line for like things that are art? I think there's something very interesting about that, and I would be inclined to say that something like a sandbox type experience may not be, you may not consider it art unto itself, but the thing that results from it, like the players, singular or plural, interaction with that system and with each other in the game can become something that I think becomes art, even if you don't consider the initial game itself to be art. Just like you might say, like, a canvas is an art, and a paintbrush is an art, and a painter is an art. You combine these things with a paint, and it produces art. I think that you could definitely make an argument for something like that.
EVE Online, also in the Museum of Modern Arts. Apparently, this is a more common thing than I thought.
Yeah, okay, maybe it's not so significant that they might just have some sort of video game or like modern media. I mean, it's a modern art museum.
Yeah.
But they might have like a multimedia kind of thing.
That game company made it in with Flow, but not Journey, so this list sucks.
Yeah, this is wrong. Journey's cool.
Journey's a good game. All right. We've gone off topic enough.
Well, yeah, I think we.
If there's one thing that I
stuff.
pride this podcast for doing, it's staying on topic.
Staying on topic, yeah. I came up with a topic list. Dang it!
And we mostly stuck to it.
I mean, we hit 2 of the 3 things on it, so that's pretty good.